Why does it seem that doing the wrong thing is easier than doing the right thing? Okay, so what I basically what I think is the short answer, so to speak, is just that we want what we want, right? We want our own way, basically. But I said that I couldn't think right off the bat of a few of the scriptures, but I did come up with a few. This week passed very quickly, it seemed like, with all of the things that were going on. So I didn't get necessarily to get all the scriptures, but we don't need to go through all the scriptures that deal with it. So, but there were a couple. But the bottom line is we want to do our own will instead of what God's will is, and we have to sort of conscientiously choose to do God's will. So a couple of scriptures that just point to that right away. James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. Says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. Now keep in mind, what did we say that when we were talking about what is evil? What is the definition of evil? Against God's will, right? So God can't be evil because he doesn't do against his will. But we do what's against God's will. So, well, that goes back to what we were talking about last week too, as far as what is he gives us a choice, right? And so by giving us that choice, we have the ability, the option to not do his will. And so that's where evil comes into play. But he says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lusts. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings death. So there you kind of see the progression. How are we tempted? We're enticed by what? By our own desire or lust. That's how it starts. And then when it has conceived, or when we give into it, it gives birth to sin. Then we sin, and then that leads to death, to separation from God, which is what. Now let's go back to Genesis 3, like what you were just saying, Dave. Genesis 3:6. You can see that same exact progression here with whenever the devil is talking to Eve. And it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. So there's that same, she looked at it, saw it, wanted it, and then took it. And what had God told her? Not to do it. So that's where it's our will versus God's will. And that's the first. They had two commands, I guess, right? Two commands God gave them, right? What were those commands? Do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the other command, if you want to call it a command, take care of the garden, right? So that was their jobs. That's what they had to do. So the only way to commit evil at that point was to do what? Yep. That was it. And we know what they chose. So that kind of shows why it's easier to do the wrong thing. Then a couple other scriptures here. Genesis 6, 5 and 6. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So here again, now time-wise, I don't know exactly how much time has passed since the creation of the world here. You know, there's different estimates. But we're in chapter 6 of Genesis, and already look at how corrupt people have become. And then going back into the New Testament, Mark 7, 20 through 23. And he was saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these things proceed from within and defile the man. Now, this isn't a discussion that he's having dealing with clean and unclean food and also traditions, and how his disciples weren't necessarily following the traditions that the Jews had established. And so he's saying that he's talking about, it's not what you eat that defiles you, it's what comes out, what you say and what you do. And out of our heart, or out of our heart proceeds the evil thoughts. So there again, it's from within ourselves that this happens. Go back to Matthew 7, 13 and 14. This kind of points to why is it easier? Well, it doesn't point to why it's easier, but it says that there are going to be more people that don't choose to do God's will. It says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. For the gate is small, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. So those things indicated, and then just the final kind of follow-up on that, Proverbs 21, verses 2 through 4. Every man's way is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. To do righteousness and justice is desired by the Lord rather than sacrifice. Haughty eyes and a proud heart, the lamp of the wicked is sin. And then dropping down to verse 24, proud, haughty, scoffer are his names, who acts with insolent pride. And I wanted to end on that because pride is, I think, a key in that. We want, again, going back to, we want our own way, our own, what we desire comes first in our minds. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes.
He doesn't do and
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
Romans 7, starting around 17 or 18.
Yes, yeah, where he talks about that he does what he doesn't want to do, but he doesn't do what he should do. Yeah, Romans 7:17. So now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which indwells me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the wishing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I wish, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not wish. But if I am doing the very thing I do not wish, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which indwells me. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wishes to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. All right, so yeah, that's definitely a good example of what we're talking about there. We know what we want to do. We want to do what God wants us to do, but we just, at the same time, we want what we ourselves want, and that conflicts and causes problems. You know, and we talked about that a little bit. There's different ways we can sin. Like when we're angry, we sin out of anger and not having self-control. Then there are times where we just choose to do the wrong thing because we want to. So all those things can kind of come into play there. And there's probably, like I said, I think there's several other scriptures that we could go to as well. that kind of discuss that. But those were some that came to my mind, and that one in Romans is a good one because it talks about the conflict that we have, kind of exactly what you were saying. Like, why does it seem like we do the wrong thing? Right. All right, so let's go back, and now we're going to do a little summary on where we were at as far as to bring us up to speed on this. So we were talking about Thomas Warren. What we're basing a lot of this study on is Thomas Warren. He did a book called "Have Atheists Prove There Is No God?" Because one of the biggest arguments that are made, one of the most common argument made against there being the God of the Bible as we see him in the Bible is the argument that if God is all powerful and God is all good, then how does evil exist? Because it seems to, like, on its face, it seems like a contradiction. And so what we did last week is we went through and talked about how evil, what is evil, like we already talked about what is evil, and then we talked about, does the premise that the atheist in this case, Mackey, made, does it really hold water? Because he adds a couple things, caveats to that. One is that something evil, the presence of evil indicates that God cannot be either all powerful or all good, and he also claims that something good will always drive evil completely away, will not allow evil to exist. We talked about, so we talked a little bit about what things are subject to power. For instance, is it possible that you can have a four-sided triangle? You can't, because a triangle has three sides. So is it possible for God to create a four-sided triangle? Well, he could, but if he did, then he would be, going against the world that he created, the laws that he established. So some things in our world are not subject to power. You don't claim that an all-powerful being can do anything per se, because some things aren't subject to power. But anything that is subject to power, God can do. And then, like I said, I mean, yes, in theory, he could do anything, but it would totally contradict and countermine his creation if he were to make changes that totally go with the natural laws. And that's going to be something that we're going to discuss a lot as we start talking about pain and suffering as well, because there are natural laws and physics of our world that lead to suffering and pain. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. We also talked about why does evil exist? And based on what we already talked about with what is evil, things that don't have motives, that have no thought, can't be evil, right? We talked a little bit about that. So in other words, like the hurricane that just came through and did all that destruction and killed people, is that evil? Not in and of itself, yeah, because it doesn't have any ill will towards anybody. An inanimate object can't think about trying to kill somebody or cause harm. It just does as part of what it is. And we'll get into that a lot more here as well. But what truly is the cause of evil and what has caused all the problems in our world is the fact that we have been given choice. We can choose whether we're going to serve God or not serve God. And because of that choice, that's where evil comes into play. And where sin comes into play and all these problems that we have is because we have that choice. And if God didn't give us that choice, then he wouldn't have created the world that he created, and he wouldn't have created us the way he created us. Because we are, the point is that we have the choice as to whether we're going to serve him or not. And by just the nature of having that choice, it's not possible for God to not allow evil, because that is our choice. So because of that free will that we have, that's where evil and everything that is bad comes from. So that kind of brings us up to to where we were at, and we had just gotten started talking about, so basically that disproves, as long as you agree with that line of thinking, that disproves the atheist statement that because evil exists, there can be no God. Because we know why evil exists. It exists because we have the freedom to choose whether we're going to serve God or not. But then that leaves, well, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? A lot of people also don't believe in God because they see the things around us and they say, well, I don't believe in a God that would allow all that. So we see that. So we're going to kind of go into discussing, well, so what causes pain and suffering, and what are some of these things? I want to start off, we'll go back and kind of pick up where we left off last week, and that's, we read Romans 5:12 through 21, kind of just getting back to what was the sort of the cause of that. One of you guys want to read that?
Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and the way of death came to all people because of all sin. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account. There is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who patterned one to come. But the gift is not to trespass. For the many died by the trespass of one man, however much more than God's grace, and the gift that came from the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, overflowed to the many. Nor the gift of God can be compared to the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin, brought condemnation, but the gift followed the trespasses and brought justification. For if by the trespasses of one man death reigned through the one man, however more, who received God's abundant provision of grace, and the gift of righteousness reigned in life through one man, Jesus Christ. Consequently, as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, also it brought righteousness act, resulted in justification and life for all people. Just as though disobedience of one man many were sinners, were also through the obedience of one man many became righteous. The law brought in so that trespasses may increase, but sin increased, and grace increased all the more. So that just as sin reigned in death, but also grace might reign through righteousness brought to bring eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of important things here. Of course, this initially this just kind of answers, well, where did all this pain and suffering come from, and sin and all that. In a broad sense, pain and suffering was caused by Adam's sin and brought about by the curse on the world. And in a more limited sense, we bring much pain and suffering on ourselves just by the things we do, doing things that are against God's will. So we've talked about the pain and suffering that can be caused by the things we do: drinking, smoking, drug use, sexual promiscuity, the way we treat each other, people lying to each other, stealing from each other, oppressing each other, killing each other. All these things, of course, lead to pain and suffering. The other thing that we see in this passage is something that we've talked about quite a bit, and what's something of import, and that is God's view of time and of what this life here is versus eternity. And it's hard for us to get it because we only know here. We only know this world. We only know this time. And it seems like well, for some people it seems like it's a long time, but there's a lot of passages that you read in the Bible that talk about how short life is, that it's only like a vapor. So that kind of sets the table for whenever you start talking about what is pain and suffering versus what is eternity, like a short period of pain and suffering versus living eternity either in heaven or in hell. Which one's more important? Yes, Ellen. Well, and some people are. I mean, yeah. And it just depends. It depends on what your perspective is on it. And anytime we're going through a hard struggle, which, as we've discussed, all of us are going to go through hard struggles at different times. Like, we're either going to see somebody that we love and care about in pain and dying, or we ourselves are going to go through it. Some more so than others. It just depends on that. Here's a question in relation to that too, kind of dealing with the time, because this is where it does get very difficult, at least in my mind, to fathom. Is, God exists outside of time. God created us. How does that work? Because we can't fathom that. We know beginning, we know end, we know that we are born, we're going to die. We know the world was created, it's going to end. Like, we know all those things. But how does something exist outside of time? But along with that, does God know what it is to suffer? Does God know what it means to suffer? Well, is Jesus God? So Jesus is God. He exists outside of time, but he came here in time and suffered and died on the cross for us. So in a way, like I said, this is where I have trouble thinking of how to say it or how to fathom it, but in a way, God knew what suffering was before he ever created the world. And I mean on a physical level, like he would, because he exists outside of time. That kind of blows my mind. It's kind of hard to fathom, but you get what I'm saying. Yes, God knows what it's like for pain and suffering, to have pain and suffering, because he sent his son and he died one of the cruelest deaths you could possibly die, one of the most painful ways of dying. So I think that God does know what it's like to suffer, and has always known what it is to suffer. Okay. Yeah, and I didn't even go into that as far as, when it says God was sorry, did he make a mistake in making people? I don't think that's what that's indicating there. It just indicates that he felt sorrow for what was happening, even though he knew by giving us a choice that was going to happen. He felt sorry and sorrow for what was happening with people on earth at that time. And then here's a question that, as we start into pain and suffering, that Warren asks in his book. He says, is pain an intrinsic evil? And you know what intrinsic means in and of itself. Is pain evil? Right. Yeah, and based on our definition of what is truly evil, pain can't be evil in and of itself, because it doesn't have a will that's against God's will. So it can't be in and of itself. But as you were just saying, is all pain evil? Well, some pain is actually very good. Like when you touch a hot stove, you don't leave your hand there. And there are some people who have some kind of condition where they don't receive pain, and those people have a lot of trouble because they don't know when something's a problem. They don't know to pull their hand away from a hot stove or things like that. Or for instance, yesterday I got into some thorn bushes, and so I could feel that I have some splinters in my hand that are going to need to come out. If you don't feel any pain, you don't know that, right? So pain is not. When we have pain, we know that sometimes we need to go to the doctor to get something checked out. So it's not in and of itself evil. Now then, on the flip side of that, somebody can feel pain that has no good purpose, and that doesn't indicate any help. It's just something that happened because we accidentally cut ourselves, or had an accident, or somebody intentionally harmed somebody else or things like that. So in and of itself, pain's not good or bad. It's what we do or what the cause of that pain is that can kind of determine whether it's good or bad. Now here again, Warren, whenever he's answering the question, he actually asks two more questions. See, I know, he's a debater, so he'll get more complicated and sometimes in the way that he goes about talking about these things. But he asks two additional questions. He says, "To whose will do you attribute evil, and is it in harmony with God's will?" So to say that a state, thought, or action is intrinsically evil is to say that some will brought it about and that it is out of harmony with God's will. So in relation to pain, the mere fact that an action has resulted in pain does not make it intrinsically evil. A parent is not evil when he or she spanks a child to correct him or her. Now, in today's society, that may be something that somebody debates as to whether it is evil or not, but I'm not passing judgment on that. What is the purpose of punishment of a child? Correction, to better them. It's not necessarily pain that the parent's after, it's to correct and guide in the right direction. A doctor is not evil when a procedure he or she performs to save a life causes a person pain. How many of you have had surgery? Do you feel pain after surgery? Yep, you do. But what caused the pain? Something that was done for your benefit, something that was to better you. So the motives and actions of those inflicting the pain play a role in whether what is happening is good or evil. In some instances, like we were talking about, pain is good. He goes on, it lets us know when something is wrong. Pain or suffering is not intrinsically good or evil. It depends on the motives behind the action that caused the pain or suffering. If the pain or suffering is not caused by a person, then it cannot be intrinsically evil because there is no will involved. And that's what we were talking about, natural calamities and things like that, which we'll get into here. They're not out to get somebody. They're not, like what you talked about in Job, whenever all those bad things are happening to Job, his friends come, which we haven't gotten into yet, but his friends come and start saying, well, you did something really bad because look at all the bad stuff that's happening to you. And in this instance, those events actually were caused intentionally to harm Job, but not as punishment, right? It wasn't as punishment that this was happening. But if the pain or suffering is not caused by a person, it cannot be intrinsically evil because there is no will involved. And as was mentioned earlier, all pain and suffering are caused by sin. Going back to what Dave asked earlier on when we started here, they're all caused by sin in a general way. Because when God created the world, was there any pain and suffering? No. So pain and suffering didn't enter the world until sin occurred, until we broke God's will. However, as we can see, also pain and suffering can actually be good in certain circumstances, so they cannot be intrinsically evil. All right, so then he goes on to discuss pain and suffering in the context of God's purpose for creating the world. So what was God's purpose in creating the world we live in? For people to enjoy a godly life. We have the opportunity to. Yep. Anybody else? Companionship? Maybe in a manner of speaking, though I don't think that would be necessarily the main reason for it. Because he could have created, any beings for companionship as far, like he wouldn't have to create this world for that. So in a way, in a manner of speaking, perhaps. Yeah, I think you may have heard that, to bring glory to him. Yep. What Warren says is the Bible clearly teaches that God created man, created the world as a veil of soul making. Now, I mentioned that probably a couple weeks ago. Veil of soul making. It's a, you know, it's a probationary period. And well, I'll keep quoting him rather than trying to say it here. A veil of soul making for him, and planned for our life on earth to be a probationary period which ends at the moment of physical death. So he created the world to be a place where we can choose to follow him or not follow him. And at the end of that period, when we die, that's the decision's been made at that point. So when you think about it from that perspective, that it's designed as a place where we can choose whether we're going to follow God or not follow God, what would the characteristics of this ideal environment be to meet that purpose? What needs to be present in order for that choice, for us to have that choice? Something where we have the opportunity to make the choice.
Because if everything was sunny and perfect the whole time, it doesn't provide the challenges that either help them grow. You know, they can go one way, they can overcome it and grow as a Christian, or they can succumb to it and fall away.
Right. So going back to what we were talking about in Job, if Job's friends were right, that you get, or if the prosperity gospel was correct, and you get more benefit from serving God automatically. You know, the more good you do, the more rich you are, the healthier you are, all those things. Or if the worse you did, the more sin you committed, the more punishment you have. If that were the case, then what do you think most people would choose? We go back to what to what God and the devil in this conversation, when the devil said, "Does Job serve you for nothing? You created this hedge around him and gave him all these blessings." They would go back to that, saying, you know, we serve God only because of the rewards that we receive, and not because of anything else. So would that bring glory and honor to him? Going back to what someone talked about with the glory and honor. So that would be one thing. It can't be a world in which we experience only pain, which we experience only pleasure, pleasure and no pain. If that was the world we lived in, where you could never have, you didn't have any pain involved, that wouldn't serve the purpose that it was created for. It also needs to be one that allows us that free choice that we've talked about, free moral agents. God, at the same time, God needs to be able to reveal himself to us in a way that doesn't overwhelm us. Because if we were, once again, if you're Moses face to face with God, and having conversations with God every day. Now, he did do this with certain people, but as a general rule and an overall thing, if God were in front of us every day, then that would overwhelm us. You would have no choice in what you were doing. It would overwhelm us so that we would not be free. Yet at the same time, the distance can't be so great that we don't know, that we can't tell that there's a God that exists. Going back I think you guys have probably heard me say this before, but when I start thinking about how you talk about children believing in God because of their parents and what their parents taught them, which is true. I was raised, taught the Bible, and learned from my parents. But at the same time, to me, where that concrete comes from, concrete foundation comes from, is I start down a questioning road. Well, where did we come from? Do we believe that it makes more sense that somebody created the world, or that the world just happened to come? Which way makes more sense? When you come to the conclusion that there had to be a creator, then it's okay. Well, did that creator just leave us here with nothing, or did the creator leave us something to tell us about why he created the world and what we're supposed to do? So then you go down, okay, well then there's lots of different religions that you can go to and look at that have their way of thinking on that. You go to you could go to like I said, different places, but you go to the Bible and you start reading it, does it hold up? And if you didn't get that it does, then this is where I start to, most people that I know, or a lot of people that I know, will claim that they do believe that God created the world and that the Bible is his word. Then I come to the point of, I'm saying, well, if that's what you believe, why isn't that the most important thing in your life? Why aren't we reading it? Why aren't we studying it? Why aren't we trying to follow it as best we can? And of course we can't follow it perfectly, but why aren't we doing that? Because if we believe it, that's what we should be doing. So anyway, that's a little bit sidetracked from what we're talking about here, but going back to, at the same time that, so God needs to be, he created the world in a way that we can see there's a God, we can try to seek him out, but it's not forced upon us. We're not forced into serving him. That's, for anybody who wants to know, that's called the epistemic distance, the perfect distance or whatever, where we can know that God exists, we can find out what he wants from us, but it's not forced upon us. Also, the ideal environment would provide for our needs, but also provide challenges to our intellectual powers and knowledge and our physical capabilities. And it needs to offer the challenge of overcoming obstacles and adversity. We kind of talked a little bit about that, and I might be jumping ahead of myself here, so I might repeat this again. But if there was no evil and nothing wrong, there wouldn't be any good either. You couldn't, we talk about the brave sacrifice of firemen, of police officers, of our soldiers, and how they lay down their lives to help others. There wouldn't be any honor in that, or in helping others, if there was no wrong, no evil to deal with. And I think that was from C.S. Lewis. We talked about that, like how he discusses, the morality and how you can't have love and goodness without having the other side. So also the ideal environment would have enough pleasure to show the goodness of God and to make us long for a permanent home with him. And actually that's something that I kind of think of. That didn't necessarily come from Warren there, but there was a book that I think I've talked about before by Ted Decker, where he's talking about how Christians often, who should be the happiest people on earth and the most hopeful people on earth, but we don't look like it because we're all down in the dumps and we don't do what we're supposed to do. And it's because God gave us pleasures here, and we should enjoy those pleasures, and we should be happy with them, and look at them as a foretaste, a little bit of a taste of what we're going to have when we go to heaven. So, we should long for that permanent home with him, and it must, like I said, also allow us to be able to come to the conclusion that God exists. That would be the perfect world. Also, the ideal environment would allow humans to choose to live as children of God or not to, like what we talked about. But at the same time, it can't, like we were talking about, it can't just be, well, if you are a child of God, you're blessed immeasurably here on earth, and you're always healthy and wealthy and all of that. And at the same time, it can't be that if you're evil, you're always punished. And it can't be vice versa either. What's the saying that we have that kind of talks about that? The rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? There's not preferential treatment per se. Now, then there are some things that we're told if you do this, you might have to suffer the consequences of it. Or if you do this, there are blessings to it. Like there are things like that, but nothing's guaranteed. We're not guaranteed that just because we do the right thing, it's always going to work out the way we want it to. We're also not guaranteed that if we sin, I mean, there's lots of people who commit a lot of atrocious and bad things, but they end up benefiting and doing okay. So it's not one way or the other. And also, the ideal environment would be one in which things that occur are insignificant when compared to the issues of eternity. And this is what I was mentioning before. What's our view? Paul is one of the ones that I always go to. He had that view of eternity, like whatever happens to me here doesn't matter. as long as I stick with what God wants and I end up going to heaven to be with him. What's he say? It's much better for me to depart than to be here, but for your sakes, I know I need to stay a little longer. Paraphrasing, of course. I have trouble quoting the exact verse there, but so the decisions that we make are important to us in our daily lives, but on an eternal scale, they wouldn't seem of that much import, right? As we go. So, as we're just about out of time, does the world possess these characteristics? Does our world, does it meet that? I think it does. What's that? Yeah, we have our choice. We can see that God exists. We have all those things fit. So anyway, we're out of time for the day, but we'll come back and kind of finish that discussion, and then, like I said, we're going to get into more discussing some of these things like natural calamities and things like that as to how they impact us. All right, thanks for your comments, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes.